Hunting and shit hit the fan. Guys, we're going to double tap this comment today. I feel that it has to be done because anytime I mention hunting in SHTF, I get comments down below. And they almost always quote the Great Depression game numbers and say, there's not going to be any game like right after the shit at the fan kicks off because everyone's going to kill it all. And they like to compare our modern population numbers versus, Great Depression population numbers. And so we're going to talk about it. And we're going to do this because I feel that this perspective is used by a lot of preppers and survivalists to not learn how to hunt. I feel that that's what it is. They say, oh, the game's going to be gone. Like, what's the point? And if you look at the prepping and survivalist communities, especially the prepping communities, the huge, massive majority of people don't know how to hunt. They don't get a hunting license. They don't get out. They don't do it. They don't know how. And to me, this is something that you absolutely need to learn how to do. Because although it might not be a part of the 80-20 for you initially and shit hit the fan, it sure as hell might turn into it a year down the road. And what's the 80-20? It's that 20% of what we do produces 80% of the results. So for those of you out there that don't want to learn how to hunt, man, you know how Murphy's Law is. You know how it is, man. Murphy is going to bend you over the tailgate of your pickup truck and stick it to you and shit hit the fan. And I know a lot of people just like, oh, it's going to be easy to kill deer. I hiked 2 miles down a national forest beginner trail to a waterfall, and I saw a deer just standing there. It'll be so easy to shoot him and shit hit the fan. I went camping once, and I woke up and there was a deer at my campsite. So, I could just shoot deer whenever I want. That's kind of the perspective, but that's not really how it works. And it's extremely different once the hunting pressure is on those animals. It's extremely different. This is also one of the reasons I always talk about snaring rabbits, guys. I guarantee you that rabbits did not almost go extinct in the eastern portions of the United States during the Great Depression. I guarantee you they didn't, man. I'm sure the numbers were affected. Squirrels had a hard time of it. I know that. They almost went extinct in areas. The deer had a hard time of it. Other game animals as well had a hard time of it. In some places, they had a harder time of it than they did in others. But let's talk about it, dude. So first, what we need to do is we need to compare some population numbers and get an idea of what we can expect if we see a shit hit the fan scenario like the Great Depression happen again. Because that's what the Great Depression was, right, guys? A lot of you have great-grandparents that lived through the Great Depression as kids, and they still save everything. It had an impact on them for the rest of their lives. And so if we had another economic collapse today, and I'm going to take economic collapse and I'm going to use that as my argument, as my shit hit the fan scenario for this topic, because it's the one that most mimics the Great Depression and the one that would have the worst effect on game animals, in my personal opinion, right? Because what are we looking at here? We're looking at, an economic collapse, possible civil or revolutionary war, and then we're looking at possible full nuke war with Russia, right? So Great Depression, let's look at it. Back then, when it kicked off, 122 million Americans, 30% of which lived in poor rural areas. And these people in poor rural areas were the ones that depleted the game numbers in the Great Depression. Okay, so 30%, we're looking at 37.5-ish million people. We look at America today, roughly 330 million Americans, 20% live in rural areas, so that gives us what? That gives us 66 million. So not quite twice as many people. But here's the big difference between rural Americans today and rural Americans of the Great Depression. Rural Americans today feed themselves at Walmart. They do not rely on hunting to supplement their food. Whereas rural Americans in the Great Depression did back then in the 20s. They fed their families hunting, fishing, and growing their own food. And I know a lot of people that are rural these days, they like to think that that's who they are, but the huge majority of them feed themselves at Walmart, guys. You know, there's some people that have like a little garden every year, and there's some people that go out and hunt, probably higher percentages per capita than in urban areas. But let's look at that. Let's look at the hunting numbers. So in America today, 4% roughly of Americans get a hunting license every year. That doesn't matter if they're going to go hunt ducks or geese or squirrels or deer. It really doesn't matter, right? Just 4% of America tries to go kill something or plans to try to go kill something every year. We don't have the hunting numbers from the Great Depression. There's anecdotal evidence that a lot of the poor rural people were out hunting illegally because they couldn't afford the hunting licenses, right? But what we can do is we can look at the numbers from 1960. We have those, and it was 7.7% of the population, so almost twice as many as today. So it's probably safe to assume that 10% or more of the population hunted back in the Great Depression. Getting back on the game numbers for a minute here, they were impacted in a really, really bad way, but it took 10 years to get it there. So even though we have more rural Americans today, they're less proficient at hunting. They're more reliant on the freezer section at Walmart than they are at hunting, cleaning, butchering, and storing all that meat than they were back then. Very easy to argue as well that marksmanship skills aren't what they used to be. I've seen this in my lifetime, and I'm not even an old ass dude. I'm just an old dude. It seems to be part of why America is always going to these bigger, hotter, faster cartridges. You know, the 30-30 Winchester used to get it all done, man. And do we need bigger, hotter, faster, flatter shooting cartridges these days because deer can smell us from further off than they could 100 years ago? No, man. It's like our stalking skills have gone on the toilet. Our marksmanship skills have gone down the toilet. Our ability to preserve or even our own food or provide it for ourselves has all gone down the toilet. The quality of people has also gone down the shitter. I'm willing to bet that in an economic collapse in America, people are more likely to target and victimize each other than they are likely to go out to the woods with the long gun and learn how to become a proficient deer hunter. So bottom line, when it comes to the population statistics, is although we have more people, they're less proficient at hunting easily. That's easily the case. And even though 4% of Americans get hunting licenses, a lot of dudes can't even kill a deer. They can't even fill their deer tag every year. Let's look at the current game numbers, because game numbers right now still aren't what they were before the Great Depression. So we have less game out there than we had 100 years ago, roughly. So that does mean that game populations will be affected more rapidly by hunting in this kind of situation. But what are we looking at here? Are we looking at game being wiped out in 2 months? We're not looking at that. We're looking at probably 5 years, maybe less than that, maybe 4, maybe even 3. But does that mean that hunting in a shit hit the fan scenario isn't a viable option? Does that mean it's unintelligent? Absolutely not. There's something else that always gets brought up, is that people are going to be competing for this resource and they're going to get violent with one another. Let me ask you guys this, because I haven't actually looked for this information. I'm probably going to do it when I'm done with this video, but who has looked up instances during the Great Depression where hunters got violent with each other over a deer carcass and exchanged gunfire? Who's looked it up? I'm willing to bet that it probably never happened, maybe happened in a small number of circumstances. Okay, that's kind of where I'm at with it. Now, yes, there was a much higher caliber of American back then. They would give a stranger the shirt off their back. You know what I'm saying? They would invite a stranger in and feed them dinner and let them sleep somewhere so they could be back on their way in the morning. These days, we've got guys that are walking on the street and cheap shotting like 80-year-old women so they could steal their purse. So I can easily agree that in a modern SHTF that you could see people getting violent over a resource like wild game. Again, though, you got to think about what kind of people get out and hunt and do it proficiently and put meat on the food for themselves or their family, right? And there's a number of them that are shitheads, absolutely. But it tends to be a higher caliber of people than what you see in urban places. And I know this, guys, because I have lived in big cities. I've spent a lot of years of my life living in big cities. I still go to big cities. I was just down to the butthole of California the other day visiting family. And so I've gotten to see the difference between rural people and the way they treat each other and the way people in the city treat each other. And there is a big difference. Real quick, let's run through a couple other scenarios. Civil war would probably look much the same as economic collapse when it comes to how it would affect game numbers. Although it could impact them a little worse or not quite as bad, kind of depending on how that whole thing goes down. Full nuke war. Let's talk about that real quick. Princeton ran a simulation in 2019, and they saw 91.5 million Americans dying within hours in a full nuke exchange with Russia. So almost a third of the population of the United States. And now that does not count the people that would be killed by fallout. So you can take that number and you can ramp it up probably another 50%. So we're looking at roughly half of the American population getting wiped out within a couple of months. And then you have to consider this as well, right? Because any full nuke strike is preceded by EMPs. And Congress did a study on this, guys. We're looking at 90% fatalities in the United States within the first year. And so at the end of 1 year, what does that leave us with? That leaves us with 33 million Americans. And those Americans would probably resemble Americans when the Great Depression kicked off. People that are much more self-sufficient and capable. Now, how would a full nuke war affect the game numbers? It would affect it for sure, because there's a lot of rural areas that would be hit by fallout, and that, of course, will, deplete game numbers. But most of the U.S. population lives in urban areas and areas where nuclear targets are close. Most of the rural population does not live around good nuclear targets. There's some exceptions to that, but most of them do not. So although game populations would take a hit initially, they would recover faster than the human population would recover. So what does that mean? That means 1 year after a full nuke strike, we've got 33 million Americans, and what would be plentiful game compared to the human population. To wrap it up, dudes, the bottom line is that if Americans in the Great Depression depended on hunting to supplement the food for their family, you should make sure you could do the same. I'm not saying you need to depend on it, but you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, man. A lot of guys are just stockpiling food, water, and ammunition, and they're just going to castle doctrine it. But when a fire comes through and burns your ass out of your home, you're going to be a refugee, and you're going to want to be able to hunt. And you don't want to learn it when your family's starving already. Like, it's too late to learn it then, man. Okay, you need to learn this shit now. You need to learn how to hunt. You need to learn how to snare. You need to learn how to fish. You need to learn how to grow your own food, and you need to learn how to preserve those things. That's what you have to do right now. So the idea that it took 10 years for America to wipe out game populations in the easternmost portion of the United States is not a good excuse for you not to learn how to hunt. Okay, and then think about this. What about the western 2/3 or the western 60% of the United States where the game populations weren't almost wiped out during the Great Depression? Because that's where I live. I live in areas where there are massive swaths of land that are unpopulated. There are 2 people per square mile in my county. My property, which is about an hour north of here, I have a national forest that backs right up to my property that is 1.5 million acres. Right here on the ranch, there's a national forest that backs right up to the ranch, and it's got to be at least 3 times as big. I haven't looked it up, guys, but I can drive almost 40 miles, hit a small ranch. It's probably about 5,000 acres, but that's not a huge ranch out here, okay? Drive through that ranch, and when I get past it, it's another 40 miles to see another human being. So you can't tell me that an economic collapse, 5 years of it, is going to wipe out game populations in my area. You can't tell me that. You can't tell me that a full nuke exchange, especially because I'm in a place where I'm not going to see fallout, is going to wipe out game populations in the area. So you can't tell me that I can't depend on hunting and shit hit the fan. Not that that's my plan. It is not my plan to depend on hunting and shit hit the fan. I got 50 cow-calf pairs out here right now. I still have some sheep. I've got rabbits. I've got chickens. And I've got all kinds of stores of food, to include meats, canned meats. Okay? But you have to think about your situation. And this brings us to the last thing, and then I'll finally wrap it up, guys. And like always, I forgot to ask you guys to like and subscribe earlier. So if you made it this far, man, hit those buttons. But the last thing you need to ask yourself is this. Do you live in the wrong place right now? Because if you live in a place right now where you can expect game populations to be decimated in months, maybe you need to move. If you live in a place right now where you expect people to be climbing your fences and trying to raid your garden at night, maybe you should move. You know what I'm saying? How important is it to you to make it through shit at the fan? How for sure are you that it's going to happen? If you're 100% sure it's going to happen in the next 4 years, man, now is the time to move, because being in the right location is definitely a part of the 80-20, right? 20% of what we do produces 80% of the results. So being in the right spot before this shit kicks off, important. Now, is learning to hunt, is it going to be a part of the 80-20 for you? It might not. It might not be, but you have it in your back pocket. So that's it. I don't really expect anyone to comment down below that there's not going to be any game and shit hit the fan because it took 10 years for people to wipe it out in a third of the United States in the Great Depression. Okay? I hope I made my point. See you guys in the next one.